Welcome to Sacred Realms. It's a great day in Hyrule, y'all. Welcome to Sacred Realms, a Zelda Retrospective Podcast for the final main episode of Season 6, covering, of course, the two 8-bit entries in the Legend of Zelda series. I'm your host, Lyndon Willoughby. I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Matt Willoughby. Matt, are you ready to close out our time with this game and with this era of Zelda games?
I am definitely ready. It has been a journey. We always knew that it would be a journey, but definitely it was better in some ways than we expected, and exactly how we expected in other ways. So, but it's been a notable entry nonetheless, and I'm glad we have come to the end of this road and are looking forward to Wind Waker. The Wind Waker. Next season.
Wind Waker hype has definitely set in this house. I am very ready. Courtesy of our guest for the week, we have now two Wii U's, so we aren't going to have to split one console to play this game,
which is really great.
Which is amazing. And yeah, I'm so ready to get back into that game, Matt. You know, I've been feeling it for quite a while. I've played it less recently than some of the other Zeldas, and yeah, I'm ready. I'm ready in my soul for a little Wind Waker. But of course, before we get into that, which is going to happen starting 2 weeks from now, we do have to close out our time with Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. Of course, we do that every season. This season, we've done it twice in a rank and recap episode, which is the one that we're going to knock out here tonight, where we kind of get our general thoughts wrapped up, and then we rank where this game falls in relation to the others that we have played up to this point. We always have a third member on these shows to, provide some extra opinions, some extra perspective, and of course to help us out in the event that we have a tiebreaker situation that needs sorting out. It's always better to have three people for those. In the past, Mike the detective has been kind enough to fulfill that role for us. But for these 8-bit games, we wanted to bring in somebody who had a lot of historical perspective on these games, the philosophy behind them, and the era in which they were made. So, just as we did for the Zelda 1 rank and recap, we are more than happy to welcome back onto the show tonight Max Nichols of Bungie to help us wrap up Zelda 2. Max, how are you doing tonight?
Hey, I'm good. Excited to be here because I really enjoyed the one for Zelda 1. I think this one's going to be even better, maybe. For some reason, Adventure of Link is just really interesting to chat about. I think because there's so much to it that is unique to it. So it's always a fun time to talk about this one in particular and be on the pod in general.
Yeah, I think it was brought up in the Discord sometime in the last week that somehow we have surpassed, I think Adventure of Link, when you try to break it down just by hours that it would take most people to beat it, about an 8 to 10 hour game, right? Which means that we have now spent more time podcasting about the Adventure of Link
Than it would take most people to play.
Yeah, and certainly longer than it actually took us to play it. So I just think that's so interesting. You're absolutely right. This game has kind of it's given us no shortage of really interesting things to talk about and to try and pick apart, and kind of a wide variety of opinions about a lot of the decisions that it makes, and a lot of what it kind of ends up being as a final product. And I know we talked a lot about that in your first appearance in this back half of the season, but there's been a lot of game to play between then and now. We've got the final chapters of the game, and having beaten it and kind of gone through that whole experience, before we get into the bulk of this episode, Max, I'd really love to hear just kind of generally, I don't know, what was the back half of the game like for you versus the front half? Did you find any notable differences? I mean, anything worth bringing up?
Yeah. So I think the last time I was on here was about the midpoint of the game, roughly, more or less. And I actually enjoyed the back half of the game a lot more than the front half. I mean, there's a lot of factors in flight, so it's hard to nail down exactly why that is. But I think a lot of it is that I basically, it took me a few hours of play before I got really used to the conventions of Adventure of Link. Like, what should I expect and when? How does it work? Like, how should I approach its combat? What expectations should I bring with me when I go to a new dungeon or a new area? So it took a little bit to kind of calibrate all those things and essentially get used to the game. And then once I did do that, I was able to enjoy it a lot more.
Yeah, and I think that for reasons we'll get into as we kind of talk about this more a little bit later in the episode, I think Matt and I are pretty much in the same place. But one thing is definitely for sure, and that is that I never would have expected to have as complex of an opinion about this game as I really ended up with. I really felt like it was going to be a pretty one and done, like one note sort of. Like, yep, that's exactly what I was expecting out of it situation. And very similar to Zelda 1, and in some ways even more than Zelda 1, that really did not end up completely being the case. And of course, we just had a whole huge batch of 2-hour episodes with a variety of people where we were able to hash all of that out. You're definitely right, Max. Something about this game just lends itself to long form conversation where you just really kind of dive into, hypothesis and analysis. And yeah, it's been a really, really great back half of this season, honestly. Like, picking this game apart has been really enjoyable.
Yeah, I mean, we have talked so much about this game, and I think that there is really a lot of really good pod that has come out of it, right? I think that there is so much to talk about because it is such a unique, such a different form of Zelda, such a different form of game. Really, it's a different format of game than either Lyndon or I have ever played ever. So like it checks so many new boxes that the whole experience was really fresh and jarring in some ways, and it just had a lot to talk about. And one of the things Linda and I were saying when we were trying to debate how to have these episodes not be as long, because we don't want to burn people out and we don't want people to get bored, right? But I don't think that we did, and I also think that there's not too much of a way to trim it down without shortchanging the game in its due, because like we have a lot of things that we talked about that we don't like or that we disagreed with the design choice or blah 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 blah, but all of that required context because we didn't want to just come out and say I just don't like this game, because that's not true, and it requires more discussion than that. Like it's I don't like these things for this reason, here's what I think could have been done differently, and like trying to provide context around our opinion instead of just coming across as this game is just not good. And I don't think that that's true. So yeah, I don't really think there was a way to have shorter episodes, and I think it was all well worth the time investment, and I hope everybody agrees.
Yep, that's always the hope. And just the feedback we've gotten in our Discord over the last few weeks, it definitely seems like everybody has been enjoying where these discussions have led. And I don't think that the topic has overstayed its welcome. So, but of course, all good things must come to an end. And the end is what we shall find by the end of this episode tonight. So it's going to be a good time. Can't wait to get into it. Let's go ahead and get the housekeeping knocked out, and then we'll dive headfirst into this massive conversation. If you didn't know, Sacred Realms is a weekly re-examination of the Legend of Zelda, one little slice at a time. Sacred Realms drops every Wednesday and is available on all major podcast networks. Every week we play a new section of a Zelda game. Then we sit down here to talk and to drop our hot takes. If that sounds fun to you, please head over to Apple Podcasts, hit that subscribe button, and be sure to leave us a review. 5-star reviews are very greatly appreciated, and they have a chance to get a shout out here on the show. If you want more Sacred Realms in your life, you can head over to patreon.com/sacredrealmspod to get access to our Discord channel, write in listener mail, vote on what game we play next, as our patrons just got finished doing, and much, much more. Additionally, one of the benefits that Master Sword members and above on our Patreon receive is that We read their names every week here on the show. Those legendary individuals are Kelso, Chris, Tiffany, Daxel, Patrice, Darknuck, Brian, George, Mike, Dylan, Allie, Lennon, Kolku, Rowan, Josh, Nick, Keep It Going, Dante, Gep, Brittany, Davey, Haru the Mighty, Derek, Albert, Mark, Andy, Cameron, Tyler, Ben, Daniel, Nick D_TV, Christian, Jonathan, Hyrule Interviews, aka Max Nichols, Garrett, and Drew. These are the most legendary of individuals. We could not make this podcast without their generous support. This list is kind of growing recently, Matt. We've got a fair amount of new names that are kind of cropping up here.
We do. We've got new folks hanging out in the Discord almost every day. New folks getting their names read. If you want to join any of that fun and action, we always have at least one, normally many, great conversations ongoing on the Discord channel in which you can get some true inside look, not only at the pod, but at some off mic talk from Cody, Josh, Max himself. Lots of stuff going on, and always worth it. So for as little as $1 a month, you can get in on that action if that sounds fun to you.
Yep, absolutely. You know, I like to believe that a little bit of this this new membership is thanks to our partnership with Zelda Universe. I feel like we've gotten a big increase in engagement ever since we started hosting our videos there. So this seems like a really good time to once again mention that all of our podcast episodes are available day and date on the Zelda Universe YouTube channel. We are very thankful to Zelda Universe for being very gracious partners in allowing us to host our content there. So.
Absolutely. It's been wonderful, and I hope that they have enjoyed and appreciated our contribution there as well, because we sure love being a part of it.
Well, lots of them keep coming on the show, so I feel like
they probably appreciate it.
The evidence seems to all point to, yes, they enjoy us. So you gotta hope so anyway. Cool. Well, without further ado, let's get into the Sacred Realms recap, which is the section of the show that we bring up once per season, sometimes twice, and we break down the all the major areas of the game that we just got finished playing. We talk about plot, dungeons, items, music, and then at the very end we rank and review this game against the other games in the series that we played. And just before we get into the Sacred Realms recap, I'm going to go ahead and reread the ranking as it stands, just so that you all have it in the back of your mind as we go forward. The ranking currently is as thus: Number 6, The Legend of Zelda. Number 5, A Link to the Past. Number 4, Link's Awakening. Number 3 is Skyward Sword. Number 2 is Ocarina of Time. And number 1 is Breath of the Wild. So with that said, let's get into part 1, which is the plot, where we kind of discuss the story that this game was telling us and how we generally feel about it. And Max, I'm gonna kind of let you go first here, because I think that there's actually quite a lot to get into in this whole section, and I know we had a fun time chatting about this with Zelda 1. So take it away. How did you feel about the plot and the story of Zelda 2?
Yeah. So Zelda 2. I think it deserves kudos for basically bringing story to the Zelda series for the first time. Really, like the difference between Zelda 1 and Zelda 2, even though Zelda 2 is still by modern standards very light on story, is enormous. Right? Like just the amount of text, the amount of characters, the complexity of the plot, even though it's still pretty simple. There's 2 Zeldas. That's complicated, right? And in a lot of ways, it kind of laid the foundation for how fans viewed Hyrule as a land, and the history of Hyrule as like the flavor that kind of they look at it with. I talked a little bit about that in the last episode, so I won't get into it too much. But yeah, I think that's kind of the big contribution here, is that like, oh, this is a land where people live. There are towns. There's stakes to the conflict, and it introduced concepts that go forward throughout the whole rest of the series, like there being multiple Zeldas and Ganon being resurrected as a danger or a thing that can happen, and the Triforce. There's 3 pieces to it, and when you get all 3 of them, it's a little bit unclear in this game exactly the mechanics of it, but special things happen. Even the Triforce crest on the hand first appeared in this one. So there's just kind of a lot going on here outside of the core gameplay loop that set the tone for the series going forward.
Yeah, I think really where I came away I guess the opinion that I came away with was that I really enjoyed the story that Zelda 2 was telling front to back. Like, you're definitely correct, Max. The trappings are pretty simple. There's not a whole lot of, narrative or exposition or anything that's kind of portrayed in the game. There definitely is more than in the first one, but there's just enough to provide kind of the outline of a really interesting story. That kind of combined with the truly massive little narrative intro paragraph that's in the game manual. Those two things together really, I think, tell a very interesting little tale here, and it's very easy for me to be excited about it for a lot of the same reasons that you just mentioned. A lot of things that I love about later Zelda games and stories are introduced here, like you said. But I do think that the story itself is actually, like, even when you put to one side the lore, and the all of those fun little canonical Easter eggs. I think that just the story itself, like, it's very simple, it's very archetypal. Save the sleeping maiden, go to these palaces, place a stone in each palace, do that whole thing. Like, I think that even though that is a very simple story, I do think it's got some very effective, big general fantasy vibes and tones to it. And for that reason, if for no other reason, I do find myself kind of imagining a lot what this game would feel like if it existed in the modern day and it had kind of room to flesh out just the story elements a little bit more. I think that there's, I think that this game and this story really have a lot more room to be able to do that. Whereas I feel like Zelda 1 is so archetypal that I just don't know if there's enough meat on that bone, really, to make that transition if anybody ever wanted to. This game, I feel like, it would be a lot easier to do that. I think you could actually you could flesh this out into an even more grander and more interesting story. But of course, we're talking about the game that we actually have here. And I think that it's effective in all the ways that it really needs to be. One thing that I really love about this game is that in Zelda 1, I never really felt like the Kingdom of Hyrule, as it was referred to, was anything resembling a kingdom at all. It really felt more like the barren wasteland of Hyrule, or the ruins of Hyrule, or whatever. And in this game, Hyrule definitely feels like a kingdom. It feels like a civilization, and I think for that reason, it has a little bit of extra character than it otherwise would have if we still didn't have like NPCs or towns or whatnot, which is a good thing, because I think that as we've mentioned in previous episodes, like, the overworld itself feels very barren to me and feels very uninteresting in this game. So having a little bit of extra interest in terms of like towns and NPCs and stuff does help to like offset that just a little bit. I don't think it covers the distance entirely for me, but it does help. Like, without that, this game really would have just felt way too empty, and I wouldn't have been nearly as interested in it. What about you, Matt? Where'd you kind of land with the story of this game?
The story, I appreciate that we do have more of a story, right? I know that this game being made in 1987? Yeah, 1987. Damsel in Distress was, pretty easy, run of the mill. And I guess this is more a complaint about the character of Zelda than the story, but so I'll save it for that, actually. The story was good, I think, and I think having the Triforce of Courage be a piece to collect after we just spent the last game collecting the Triforce of Wisdom, and we stole the Triforce of Power off of Ganon's dead body. Like, I think there was a cool continuation that happened here that you don't see from a lot of Zelda games. The only other game I can think of that I have personally played that is a sequel is Majora's Mask, being a sequel to Ocarina of Time, but there was not a lot of story continuity there outside of the search for Navi. And the seeing this story in many ways be a continuation of the previous story from Legend of Zelda was really cool. Everything you said about having a more populated Hyrule, having a more engaging and full place, full feeling place because of NPCs, because of towns, because of all the things that make a kingdom. All of those were really, really great additions. So I think that for a game that was made in the time that it's made, they did a great job of having those story elements. Granted, almost all of it is outside of the game in the game manual, but again, product of the time, that was normal. So, I don't want to knock the game for that, because that is how it was done. That's how it had to be done. So I think that works well for the time period that this game was made in.
I want to circle back to I like, and real quick, Max, sorry, I just want to get one thing in real quick, and I'm sure you'll have a lot to say about this as well, but I want to talk about this game as a sequel. Kind of putting to one side how we feel about its story as a standalone product, I do think it's very interesting to talk about this game being a direct sequel, which is something that we really don't get a lot of in Zelda, right? We know the timeline of all of these games, and every now and again we know that a game, Link's Awakening is a direct sequel to A Link to the Past, for instance. Majora's Mask to Ocarina of Time, as you mentioned, and then I wouldn't say it's a direct sequel, but A Link Between Worlds is definitely a years later sequel to A Link to the Past.
Oh yeah, in Japan, actually, they called A Link Between Worlds A Link to the Past 2, or rather, Kamigami no Triforce 2. So they explicitly called it a sequel in Japan.
And that was its release name.
Yes.
Gotcha.
That was on the packaging.
Cool. Which actually makes sense, because even A Link to the Past, as we kind of said in that season, in Japan had a different name than the Western release. So yeah, kind of is appropriate that A Link Between Worlds would follow suit. But yeah, so anyway, we do have direct sequels in the series, but even all those other examples, I feel like we know that they are direct sequels to previous games, but the narrative doesn't spend a whole lot of time really dwelling on that. It's always referenced kind of obliquely. And I feel like that's because in the modern era, or even, I guess the N64 era is no longer the modern era, but like at a certain
25 years ago when Ocarina of Time came out.
Yeah, that's been a minute. Okay, so yeah, definitely not the modern era. But like moving on from kind of the 8-bit era, I feel like there was an intentional effort being made on the part of these game designers to make it so that the game and its story were approachable regardless of whether or not you had played the previous entry, Yeah. And anything else, like any Easter eggs that you might pick up having played the previous game, were just icing on the cake. It's just a little something extra to find and to know. This game really does not do that at all. This game directly references a lot of stuff from The Legend of Zelda, and especially the narrative material in the manual is very directly referencing of things that we did in the previous game. So I think that actually makes this game kind of an anomaly in the series as a whole.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the main plot threads, if you can call it that, in this game is the threat of Ganon being resurrected by using the blood or the ashes of the person who defeated him, Link. So like there's a catalyst for the plot in Zelda 2 is the events of Zelda 1, which is just really not how it's ever done in any of the other sequels in the series.
TBD whether or not Tears of the Kingdom kind of breaks that streak, because I have somewhat of a suspicion that game is actually going to reference much more heavily the events of Breath of the Wild, than an older Zelda game would have done for its immediate predecessor. But yeah, I think even though that's not something that happens in this series a lot, I think in this game it is really effective. And again, it's really just because I think it's able to be done so simply here because a lot of this story was being communicated in out of game places like manuals and stuff like that. So like when all of that stuff is doing the heavy lifting, it's a little bit easier to kind of draw those direct narrative lines from one game to the next, right? Because all you have to do is just write it in paragraph form of like, hey, after Link did this thing, then he went and did this.
There is something Matt said was like, you have to read the manual for a lot of the story. And while that is still true to get a lot of the details of the story, compared to Zelda 1, the amount of story you can get just from in-game content is vastly more. Like you can actually get a picture of like who is the enemy, what is my goal, who are these people I'm helping, like what is the kingdom of Hyrule. Like you can kind of get all of that from the content of the game without ever looking at the manual, unlike with Zelda 1, which I think is a huge step forward in just a year or so. There's only about a year between Zelda 1 and 2.
Yeah, and I'm actually trying to remember now. I know that townspeople, for instance, will drop little like narrative bits and little sentences and snippets of conversation that kind of allude to the story that's happening. Of course, the game over screen is pretty explicit about the consequences of failure, right? When you get the game over and it says, "Hey, guess what? You died. Ganon returned."
Sucks.
Yeah, exactly. So
we made that little paste with Link's blood and Ganon's ashes, and then spread it on his bones. So
that's still the paste of resurrection. Yeah,
still to this day was one of the most gruesome images I've seen in a Zelda game.
Nasty, but yeah, I agree. Like I think that there's some very clear advances being made in the way that the designers even thought to try and communicate story in game versus the last one. So I definitely really enjoy seeing those steps being taken here. And again, it's one of those things where this game was so different from Zelda 1 in terms of its like minute to minute gameplay that I think having that connective tissue really does go a long way towards making it feel, connected narratively to the game before it and making it feel like it's a part of the same world as The Legend of Zelda was. So definitely kind of really appreciate that element of the story for sure. I don't know. I think I definitely felt a bit more excited about the trajectory of the story in the back half of the game than the front half. Like once we really started going to new areas of Hyrule and seeing some locations with a little bit more character, old Kasuto Town, for instance.
You mean old Katsuo Town? How about old
Matt, that one.
Kasuto. Yeah, I mean, how many different ways can I pronounce
Could
that?
be any of them. Who's to say?
We don't know.
Yeah. And then, of course, getting to the final dungeon, which I think we mentioned in our episode last week, I felt like was a really great climax to this game. In particular, just loving kind of the symbolism of the final boss, which is literally just Link fighting his shadow and having to overcome that in order to gain the Triforce of Courage. I think these are all interesting concepts and it's all interesting story material.
Yeah. Okay. Question for you two. What do you think, like if you were to summarize it in one line, what do you think Zelda 2's story is about?
I think that Zelda 2's story is about Link becoming worthy to wield a section of the Triforce.
I think that Zelda 2's story is about Link resurrecting the sleeping Princess Zelda by means of becoming worthy to wield the full Triforce, because he supposedly already has wisdom and power.
Yeah. So, good answers. The thing I had in mind when I asked was this story feels like the stakes are personal, like personal scale in a way that most other Zelda games are not. And especially Zelda 1 wasn't. Cause townsfolk will say stuff like save the kingdom, hero, or whatever, but like it never really feels like the kingdom is in danger, right?
Yeah.
I would say that the themes of this story that like kind of underpin the events of the story are that it's about Link maturing as a hero, which comes through in some of the like Emmanuel content, because like he comes of age and the crest appears on his hand and he starts learning how to cast magic and not just use swords and tools. And the final boss is against his own inner demons manifested as Shadow Link, Dark Link, or whatever its real name is.
Yeah, right. There's definitely
so like the whole story about Link growing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And there's definitely like a very intentional difference in the way that he's portrayed in this game versus the first one, where in the first game, you know, it's definitely, I think, meant to be communicated that Link is young, you know, like a young child, and definitely very new to like a life of adventuring or whatever. And I think in this game, you're right, Max, it really is telling the story about Link coming into his own as a warrior, you know, and coming into his own as a hero. And I think that both through the narrative that's told to us and shown to us, and the extent to which Link's abilities upgrade in this game, and the extent to which you, the player, learn to get better at controlling Link in this game, I think that story is actually told successfully. I think that they successfully portray Link's journey from the one thing to the other. And I think it deserves kudos for that. You know, I think that there's like, I think that that's a tricky balance to pull off and to really make people feel, especially in a game that's a little older like this and doesn't have things like, I don't know, cutscenes or, you know, a bit more heavy lifting narrative devices to sort of fall back on. But with all of that said, I feel like we've kind of already journeyed into one of our subsections of the plot, which is where we discuss the main characters at issue in each game. We're already talking about Link and about this version of Link. So let's just go ahead and continue that conversation. Max, how do you feel about this portrayal of Link the hero?
I'm actually rather fond of this portrayal because it feels like it's the first time we see the Link that in my mind is still like the truest version of Link to me personally, which is the Link to the Past and Link's Awakening version of Link. You know, he's proportioned like an adult human person, unlike Zelda 1, where he's like this weird chibi squished sprite person. And he's still got kind of the more old school character design look to him. And just there's like a piece of key art, like there's like the Adventure of Link art. Probably you could Google that and you'd find the one I'm thinking of, but he's like walking towards towards you in the image, kind of purposefully with this, you know, this sword at his side. And I am just overall fond of that portrayal of Link. And I think as a character for this era, it was like a very fleshed out, very realized character that like people were already invested in because of the success of Zelda 1. So I'm assuming most people who played Zelda 2 played Zelda 1 first, because Zelda 1 sold a lot more in Zelda 2. So I think there's just a lot going for this version of Link. Also, he's a mage knight, right? Like he's a wizard. That's cool.
That's definitely
like a paladin, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's definitely something that we don't see as being a part of Link's character really ever after this. I mean, Link has access to magical abilities in most games that he appears in, but that's never really the focus of his arsenal. It's always just like kind of one element of all of the different tools that he has to play around with. And in this game, it really is the whole thing. Like, you know, anything that is not Link's baked in combat ability besides the sword techniques, upward thrust, down thrust, everything you're acquiring for him in this game, from an ability standpoint, really is, it just comes down to magic and to spell work. And I think that that's actually like a really, that's a thing that really separates this Link from all of the others in a really interesting way, is Link the battle wizard, you know? Like, I think that that's just really fascinating.
Yeah. For me, when I think about Link and who Link is as a character throughout my journey with Zelda, this is a very different Link in a lot of ways, mostly because my primary experience is with more of the 3D versions. So I'm able to have a more personal feeling connection.
Is this a hashtag not my Link situation, Matt?
No, not at all, actually. If you'd let me finish, you'd see where I'm going with the thought.
Oh, my bad.
Come on.
I'm sorry.
I have traditionally had a harder time connecting with 2D sprites, but I actually did find myself, especially in the last quarter or third of this game, feeling more connected to this Link than I did to even The Legend of Zelda's Link.
Yep.
I felt myself like being joyful in the growth of the character and in my control of the character and in the rewards that come from the time that we have spent together growing through this journey. And much to the point of that both of you made, especially you, Max, about Link maturing as a hero. I think it's also about the player maturing as in their ability to overcome the obstacles that are so numerous and prevalent in this game. And I think that is really probably the one thing I could say in pro to the insane difficulty of this game is that while it's insanely difficult, it is rewarding to overcome insanely difficult things. And it is rewarding to see yourself adapting to those challenges and overcoming them as you progress. So all of that attributing in the game to Link's growth as a hero and personally our growth as the controller of said character. So I think that there's a lot of good to be said about this Link. That he is known throughout the realm already as the hero of Hyrule is also interesting. Some of the characters do kind of react to that. You're worthy of help, or, rest here, and, stuff about like people having confidence in Link to be able to save the kingdom. All of that is a very interesting carryover from last game that contributes to a more mature feeling Link and a Link that is still growing in this journey. So yeah. I definitely would say that I actually very much enjoyed this portrayal of Link. I don't love the sprite, to be honest. I just there's some proportionality, mostly about the shield and the tininess of the sword and like some of the other things that didn't quite do it for me. I think we talked a couple episodes about how the art style isn't our favorite, and I still think that that's true, but the character himself, I think, is well done, well portrayed, and does the growth schema very well.
And it's so interesting to me because I think when you think about the stakes of Link's struggle in this game, it's very different than most stories that we get in other Zelda games, right? Usually Link is working to ward off the impending arrival of some great evil, right? Looking to grow enough in power to be able to fight Ganon before Ganon can take over the world, or some variation of that story, right? For the most part, with a few notable exceptions, Link is always working proactively to try and ward off some impending cataclysm. In this game, it's telling a much more aspirational story, where Link is very much going on a journey, not necessarily because he needs to work proactively against some impending doom situation, but he's just trying to find a solution to a problem, right? We're trying to wake up the original Princess Zelda. But again, what we're doing is we're going into dungeons and facing enemies that are not there necessarily to defeat us and take over the world, but are there to challenge us and to be necessary obstacles so that this character can grow enough to obtain the Triforce of Courage. I think that that's a really interesting story, and I think that it's something that I would love to see future versions of Link explore a little bit more. I would love to see more games that are a bit more introspective about Link and his goals and what it really means for him to grow into being a hero, not because he is doing it out of necessity, but because he's challenging himself and
Yeah, I think most Zelda games tell the story of Link becoming a hero, right? And the most direct comparison I can really make, honestly, is like Skyward Sword, where Link has to become worthy of wielding the whole Triforce, which he does in part of that is this game, right? Becoming worthy to wield the Triforce of Courage. And exactly to your point, though, Lyndon, every single other time it is, I have to become worthy to wield the Triforce so that I can stop something. In this case, it's, I have to become worthy to wield the Triforce so that I can resurrect the sleeping princess, which we are given no context as to why that's important, other than just like, it's not good for
Yeah, other
Sleeping
than just
Beauty.
that it's like a nice thing for us to be doing.
Exactly.
You know?
So there's no context about like the kingdom of Hyrule is going to fall into anarchy and chaos if Zelda isn't awakened and becomes the ruler of Hyrule because the king's dead. And apparently the Zelda that we saved in last game is nowhere to be seen. So like if they had given it that kind of context where it's trying to prevent the kingdom from falling into anarchy and chaos, I think that changes a little bit. But because we lack that context and it really seems more like this is a side benefit of getting the whole Triforce, or I don't know, it feels different for sure.
There is one more just observation there from me, which is that if most Zelda game stories are like, they're like Lord of the Rings, right? Like the land is in danger, go on a quest with a MacGuffin to save the land, using the power of plot device. Then this is more like the Odyssey or a Grail quest that a Knight of Camelot would go on, right? Like it's a personal quest to better themselves or, improve something for themselves that they go out and do. More personal, more intimate in that way.
Yeah, I love that, and I think it's very blatantly kind of stated through the king's letter to the future hero about prove yourself worthy, right? I think that is a very good, and I like your parallel to Knights of Camelot on a quest, right? Like that. This is very much knight errant Link in the kingdom doing knight errant, and I like that.
Well, and one thing that I think is so interesting about it though is that, depending on how you want to interpret it, because the other big half of this story that we've kind of talked about a little bit is that we are trying to not get dead so that
don't die,
so that Ganon doesn't come back. Like that's the risk. The only risk here is that we might die and Ganon might get resurrected. So when you look at it that way, this version of Link is actually kind of playing with fire in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah. Maybe he should just hole up in a castle and like not die so that Ganon can't come back.
Safest thing to do for the kingdom is sit in a locked room until
that would be funny.
This Link is actually very selfish.
It's like really thinking back on it, maybe taking a boat to another continent really would have been the best thing for everybody here, Link. Just saying.
Just get out of Dodge so Ganon can't come back.
And I'm going to say the enemies are all so difficult that, the risk was actually very real here. So, yeah.
Especially because your third section of the game is Death Mountain, where you have some of the hardest enemies in the whole entire game.
Yeah.
Yeah, come on, man. Maybe we don't do that.
Thankfully, my wide repertoire of game overs are not canonically binding, and Ganon was never actually resurrected, which is good.
We didn't usher
that canonically the timeline splits when Link fails in Ocarina of Time. So
exactly.
Theoretically, you created many new branches of Zelda.
See, I was gonna say, Max. Luckily, we didn't usher in a second downfall timeline by dying here.
Well,
but,
it sounds like
maybe we did.
It sounds like we ushered in like maybe 30 or 40 of them. So that's great. That's fun. Yay us.
Woo! Sorry, everybody in Hyrule. We died a lot. It just is what it is.
Going back to your point about the sprite work and everything, though, Matt, I think, and this gets into gameplay a little bit more than plot, but I agree that, the sprite is not necessarily my favorite in the world. I like it well enough for its portrayal of Link, but I do think one thing that I never really felt like worked for me was the whole standing and crouching position situation.
Yeah.
In order to deflect projectiles that are on like different planes, like as a mechanic, like it works. It's not like it's broken or anything, but I just never felt like I got super good at being able to tell on the fly which position I should be in, Like sometimes it's pretty easy, but other times, I don't know. I just think there's not enough visual difference between those two states and between like the height of like a head level projectile versus like a knees level projectile, right?
And it becomes even more difficult whenever enemies start jumping around, like in the last dungeon where we had those bird knights that were throwing crap all over the place, or when enemies are on a different plane, like if they're on an elevated block or two elevated blocks, they're still shooting from a ground level position, but the projectile's traveling on a separate plane. So like maneuvering around that was something that was definitely very difficult for me to get the grasp of for some reason, and I never got super good at it. Like I got good enough to reliably defeat enemies that were on my same plane and didn't jump around, but past that, adding in variables there was not something I was ever great at adapting to. Maybe that's just a me problem. I don't know.
I don't think it's just a you problem. I felt pretty similarly. Does anyone have anything else that they want to say about narratively this version of Link before we move on and talk about, I guess, actually no other characters? But we're
well, I mean, we have one other character to talk about,
sure,
in name only.
Yeah.
I do want to say that I am very glad that this is, I think, the last instance, or maybe A Link to the Past is the last instance where we see the Judeo-Christian kind of glyphs and artwork on Link's character. I know that as we progress into later games, we get more traditional looking Hylian shields and less, Judeo-Christian kind of iconography throughout Zelda. And I think that is a good thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. For narrative building, if for nothing else, right? Because at that point, it becomes less about just not. I think appropriating is a bit of a strong word, but it becomes less about riding the coattails of
real world religion,
of like common fantasy, and it like starts to develop a bit more of its own visual and cultural identity after this.
I like my fantasy to be fantasy, not utilizing real world iconography stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I want to feel like I am in a separate world, and the prevalence of crosses, or, even the cross being a obtainable item within this game was like weird to me. They could have easily done just like a totem instead of a cross and
an amulet.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad that Nintendo decided to depart from using real world iconography, for sure.
Yeah, this was the last game where Cody Davies could come on and choose
Jesus Christ. Look, we stand Jesus Christ in this household, but also maybe not in Zelda.
Yeah. I feel like Cody definitely wins the award for like most out of the box and like generally unbeatable Z targeting. Like cool. Yep. You got it, Cody. Got it in one.
Good for you.
Yeah. So,
and man, that episode was full of eggs. Good golden eggs.
That's Cody Davies for you right there. The Barack Obama of Australia.
Exactly. That's the other one I was thinking of.
Yeah.
Man, that was hilarious.
So, gosh. Okay. So let's move on from Link real quick. Obviously we have, I think, even less to talk about in terms of our other two main series characters in this game than we did last game. Ganon, certainly, because we don't even see Ganon in this game,
unless you get a game over screen.
Accepting the game over screen, and then the constant threat of his resurrection that kind of hangs over everything. But I don't know. I mean, do we even have anything that we can really say about this? Like,
I was going to say that Zelda as purely a damsel in distress MacGuffin, even more so than Zelda in The Legend of Zelda, I think. Because at least in The Legend of Zelda...
We're talking about Ganon right now, Matt.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hold on. We're going to rewind that. Ganon...
You hit the bumpers.
Yeah.
Scrolled back a few screens.
And there we go. And we're back. Ganon... No, I have nothing to say about Ganon.
Cool.
I do think there's a little bit of interesting here about Ganon, because we see that even when he's gone, there is an organized effort from his remaining minions to try to resurrect him, right? Like to the point where they have spies in towns and stuff. So that's interesting because it's the first time Ganon has been shown to be like an intelligent creature, right?
Yeah.
That's fair.
Like, and he's followed by intelligent creatures, not just monsters ravaging caves in the Death Mountain area.
Well, and in some ways that gives us kind of a precursor to the Yiga clan in this game.
Oh, look at you making connections. Very nice. Yeah, that is actually a really good point, Max. I think it adds a dimensionality to Ganon, the king of evil, king of monsters, blah, blah, blah. That was pretty good. when you dig down a little bit past the surface. So thank you for that call out. It was a good one.
And it is nice because the concept of Ganon kind of coming back and being resurrected from actual death is something that is an element, especially of more of the top-down games, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ganon in the Downfall timeline is kind of constantly in a state of having died and, you know, just
being resurrected
between games, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely really nice to kind of see some narrative beats around that here. But moving now on to Zelda, which we actually do see a version of this character in this game. I think the only thing that I would want to say before I let you finish the point that you were trying to make a second ago, Matt, is that I just from a lore standpoint agree with you, Max. It is cool to see the genesis of Zelda as like a dynasty, you know? I appreciate that groundwork being laid here. And past that, there's really not much more to say about this Princess Zelda than there was the one in the last game, right? You know, we get our same "thank you, you saved me, you're a hero." This one is a bit freer with smooches. So
she's very free with the smooches.
So, but that does bring up a point because we have this recurring conversation around which Zelda and Link pairings exist in a romantic state of being and which ones are just friends, right? And I don't know. I'm interested to know where you guys think this pairing stands.
Well, I want to say out of the gate that Link in Adventure of Link is a definite ladies' man. He visited those town healers, we'll call them generously, many times in every village. So Link is spreading that love around the kingdom.
Spreading that Link love around the kingdom.
And so good on you, Link. We don't slut shame on this podcast, so good for you. And it is interesting to me. It's very Sleeping Beauty, right? Like Disney Sleeping Beauty, right? Prince Charming awakens the princess with a kiss and then they fall in love at first sight and blah, blah, blah. Like, I feel like that is kind of what Nintendo is trying to go for some reason. I don't know why. I guess it works. Sure, it works. But what I was trying to say... Oh, go ahead, Max.
I was gonna give my hypothesis about how the story ended up this way. Which is basically, I think that they started from a place of like, okay, we want to invert the trope. Instead of going and collecting pieces of the Triforce, you're going to dungeons and delivering something to them. And they're like, okay, so we have these dungeons. They need to be ancient, right? There have to be ruins. They're temples. Okay, cool. So you go to these temples, but like, okay, so now we need to come up with a story about why you go to ancient buildings. And we want you to rescue a princess, right? But oh crap, the story has to be something about ancient shit. I guess we'd better come up with a story that involves an ancient princess that you're rescuing. And I think that thought process, that's my guess. I don't really have quotes to back this up, but that's my guess of how they ended up on this really weird two different Zeldas. One of them is an ancient Zelda that's been asleep for 1,000 years. And the other one isn't even mentioned, sort of thing that they have going on here.
Yeah. And as an ending to that thought, did we just start like a Game of Thrones-esque struggle for power by resurrecting this Zelda while the other Zelda is still very much alive? Because I feel like that's what we did. So I don't think we actually helped the Kingdom of Hyrule in any way, shape, or form. We probably just started a civil war. So
I mean, other Zelda is on vacation for this entire game. So I don't know. Maybe it's time for ancient Zelda to step up and I don't know.
What's going on with the spirit of the goddess Hylia right here? Is she inhabiting both of these Zeldas simultaneously?
Ooh, good questions. Also, maybe the Legend of Zelda is not on vacation. Maybe she's actually like ruling the kingdom because we don't actually go to like the capital city of Hyrule. We go to North Palace and Great Palace, which are not like Hyrule Palace. So maybe Zelda's actually, doing her princessly or queenly duties and we just like revived a usurper to the throne. So that's another way to take that.
I do think it's a very 80s portrayal of a damsel in distress that she wakes from a centuries long slumber and then immediately feels like doing some romance.
Like, yeah, nobody feels that way when they first wake up in the morning. Come on. It's not accurate.
So there you go.
So what I wanted to say, and I know you were trying to move us on, but what I wanted to say about this Zelda as well is that damsel in distress was sort of the beeline plot point of last game as well. Kill Ganon, collect the Triforce, save the princess was like the three things from last game, right? This game, it is save the princess, and at least in the last game, Zelda's portrayal did something to proactively protect the kingdom and the Triforce, right? Like, it was off screen, sure, but she impacted the story in a way that this Zelda literally does not do. This Zelda is purely a MacGuffin, and to see the character of Zelda relegated to that always bugs me. I said very much the same thing in A Link to the Past rank and recap, is when they relegate the titular character of the series to purely damsel in distress, save the princess. I don't know. I don't love it personally.
Yeah.
I mean, she did do stuff off screen before the game, right? She saved the Triforce from being acquired by her brother, who was under control of the evil vizier or whatever. I'm still
really fuzzy on a lot of those details, by the way. I need to go back and reread the manual again, because I remember Zelda had a brother, and I know there was an evil wizard in there somewhere, but I think he died, and I don't know. It's kind of a big fantasy salad of of things happening.
Yeah. I know that, and my recollection of it is, basically Zelda had the knowledge of where the Triforce of Courage was hidden, and she chose not to disclose that to her greedy brother, who was under the control of the evil wizard. But what this storyline indicates to me is that even had she disclosed that location to her greedy brother, he would not have been able to get the Triforce, because he wouldn't have been able to pass the challenges, because he wasn't the chosen hero. So her silence, while admirable, was pretty much meaningless, because all that would have happened was her brother and the wizard would have gone to try to get the Triforce of Courage out of the Valley of Death, and they wouldn't have been able to do it. So I don't know. It's just it feels like the story contradicts itself by making the Triforce unreachable by anyone other than the chosen hero, but trying to set Zelda up as some kind of heroic character for not revealing that information.
Yeah. So let's move on from Zelda real quick and talk about the other main character of this game. And of course, this is a concept that, Max, you brought up in our rank and recap from last season, which was the introduction of the concept of Hyrule itself as a main character, which we referenced several times in this season and will probably continue to do for the remainder of this podcast, just because I think it's so true. Hyrule is such a living, breathing, and important part of our experiences with these games. So talking about the land of Hyrule as a character, Max, I'm going to send it to you. How did you feel about that in this game?
Yeah. Okay. So I have said a little bit already earlier this episode about how I felt like our perception of Hyrule was really broadened by Zelda 2. Right? Zelda 1 gave us the Hyrule that is wild places, forests, streams, rivers, mountains. Zelda 2 gives us a lot more of all of that, but also gives us civilization, townships, graveyards, fire mountains, mazes that are built across entire islands. So just what Hyrule could be, what players of this game, often children playing this game, could imagine, was just so much more vast after playing Zelda 2 than it was in Zelda 1. And I assume that a lot of Zelda 1 players probably, they were 1 to 2 years, couple years older maybe than when they played Zelda 2, if they were playing along in real time. So they probably felt like their favorite game was growing up with them. And Hyrule did that too. Hyrule got bigger and vaster and more full of possibility.
Yeah.
So I'm actually very fond of the portrayal of Hyrule in this game.
I think to me, it's a case of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The two steps forward are definitely one, like I said before, the kind of populated sense that we get of Hyrule being an actual kingdom in this game. And then the other step forward, which I haven't mentioned yet, is kind of how much I love the characterization of the palaces in this game. I think that they strike a very different tone than the dungeons in Zelda 1. Those were very much more crypt-like than anything else. And they definitely felt very much like a system of underground labyrinths, whereas the palaces in this game really do feel like that. They feel like palaces. They feel grand. They feel immense and ancient. That is definitely something that we get a lot more of in our treatment of dungeons in later Zelda games. Like, every now and again, we're in like a volcano cave or something. But like for the most part, we're in ancient palaces or ancient structures or like big grand scale areas that have like a lot of antiquity and flavor to them. And I feel like this game actually does a pretty good job with what it's given to work with from like a graphical standpoint of kind of communicating that feel around these spaces. In particular, I think as you go through the game and they start getting more complex in their layout, that really kind of helps to sell that fiction. And a lot of it too is just that a byproduct of these being side-scrolling experiences is that they just feel taller, right? Like they feel somewhat more like grand and cavernous, like you're walking through a vaulted ceiling space, like an ancient cathedral or something like that. And so I really enjoyed that quite a lot. I felt like that was a big step forward in terms of dungeon spaces. The one step back, obviously, is the same thing I've been talking about the past few weeks, which is that the overworld itself, I still just have very little interest in. It has very little character. The fact that we're so zoomed out from it makes it feel very kind of static, and it just does not have a lot of shading and flavor. Definitely not in the same way that Zelda 1's overworld did. So I think I'm still going to give it a net positive, right? I still think this portrayal of Hyrule is an improvement on the one that we saw in Zelda 1, but that overworld thing is a pretty major caveat for me.
Yeah, you don't really engage in kind of a gameplay sense with the world of the greater, broader overworld of Hyrule in this game, right? Like when you're on the overworld, you're not doing anything. You're just traveling. You're playing Oregon Trail, but without the,
without dysentery.
Yeah. You're watching an icon move in a map instead of controlling a character moving through a forest. So yeah, it does have that distance.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I feel like you both covered my main thoughts as well. Is I don't love the sense of removal that I had from the landscape, and this is something we talked about with Josh a lot. Where I think some of it can be chalked up to our inexperience with overworlds like this, which were apparently pretty prevalent within this time period of gaming in general, specifically in Japanese games, which of course Nintendo is. But it's just it's a type of overworld exploration that neither of us have ever really engaged in, and I didn't love. And I think that for me, it is not a style of overworld exploration that I want to see again, or that I feel was effective. I do, as you said, appreciate the scope, and I appreciate NPCs and towns, and your note about palaces feeling more like temples and palaces instead of crypts is well put. So yeah, I just want to give a solid agree around the table to the things that have been said.
Cool.
You mentioned there's one of the things I've been wanting to talk about, so now it feels like a good time to interject with it, is the kind of the context, the historical context this came out in. So you've already heard a little bit from Josh about how he thinks the overworld was partially inspired by Dragon Quest. And I don't know if that's actually true or not. Like I haven't really examined the timing of it or anything or found quotes about it, but as in a general sense, the games at that time, Zelda was thought of as an RPG, right? If people made lists of genres and games that went into genres, Zelda went in the same list that had Final Fantasy 1, Dragon Quest, Chrysalis, games where you leveled up and were about exploring a world and maybe had more story than like a side scroller at the time would have. So to a certain extent, a lot of the things that Adventure of Link does that are different from Zelda 1 is moving towards the expectations of the RPG genre at that time. It had a big overworld, it had towns, it had NPCs, it had more of a story, it had spells, it had leveling up. Like, it was an RPG. Which I think would be inaccurate to call a modern Zelda game an RPG by our modern standards of what an RPG is. But as recently as like 2000, like when Majora's Mask and stuff was coming out, people still talked of Zelda games as if they were RPGs. So yeah, I think that's kind of interesting. And related to that, at the time, it was received really well. But maybe you should jump in with your thoughts first, Matt.
Yeah, I was going to say, and it's wild to me that we can look at a Zelda game, really any Zelda game, and call it even remotely an RPG, because it's so classically action adventure. And maybe that's just my context of being a huge Western RPG fan. I know that, more, JRPGs and things like that are different, but other than the experience point leveling system here, there is like no aspect of RPG to me. And I guess, like, in the strictest sense, role-playing game, when you're trying to put Link forward as the characters or as the players, what's the word? Proxy, the player's proxy within the game. Maybe, but it just doesn't have any of those aspects. So, obviously I was a little too young even back in 2000 to be really following a lot of this stuff with its technical definitions and whatnot. But to me now in 2022, thinking about trying to call any Zelda game an RPG just blows my mind, because it's just so classically action adventure.
Well, does that apply to this one as well, though?
I would say this is not an RPG. Like, I don't think that. I think that like I said, the only part of this game that is RPG-esque is an experience point leveling system, which you have in a lot of action adventure games also. So, so I don't see this as RPG or even RPG-esque personally.
This is a super interesting topic to me. I won't spend too much on it, but basically, if you try to define a genre, like what does the word genre mean? Like, what is a genre category? It basically comes down to, it is a collection of tropes or conventions, whatever word you want to use for it, that occur together often enough that the audience gives them a name and uses that name to communicate what kind of experience it is. And for a lot of the history of the RPG genre, like in the 80s and 90s, the only games that had leveling systems and the only games that had stories where like lots of plot was happening were RPGs. Like, you just didn't have leveling system outside of the RPG genre in most games. And you didn't see a lot of emphasis on story outside of the RPG genre. So whenever a game came out that had either of those things or both of those things, it was thought of as an RPG. Today, in modern gaming, every game on Earth has a big story and leveling systems, right? Like, there's always some big progression system in any genre now. So the genres now are very different than they were back then.
So I think what we're talking about now is the natural byproduct of, like, over time, as games have become able to be bigger and more complex and more intentional in their specificity of design. We've kind of started to see we started to see the rule sets around what we consider to fall into what category become more specific, right? Like, now we've got games like The Witcher 3, and Skyrims and all these other games that are definitely RPGs, and we're able to call them that very confidently because they have this massive, like, wealth of systems and experiences which kind of play into that. Whereas, back in the day when this game was created, it really is just like it's all kind of a mishmash of all these various things, and I think that probably contributes a lot to why the labeling of the Zelda series might have been difficult for some people in the early years, and why it might have been kind of stuck in that action RPG camp when in reality it kind of really wasn't. I think nowadays anybody who is kind of, a gamer, plays a lot of different kinds of games, would be able to pretty accurately name some big differences between all these experiences, which kind of, and give some reasons for why Zelda probably doesn't qualify under that umbrella anymore.
Yeah.
But that definitely has not always been the case. I think that about ties up my thoughts on the plot of this game. I think let's go ahead and get into part 2 of the Sacred Realms recap, which is Best Dungeon, where we each kind of give an award for what we thought was the best dungeon experience in this game. And I'm going to go first and say that even though it is the final dungeon of the game, and I think in the past I might have made an argument for why that shouldn't be allowed to be given this award. But then the more final dungeons that we play, the more I kind of realize that good ones, like really good ones, are sort of an anomaly in this series. And so for that reason, I feel completely fine in giving that award to the Great Palace, which I thought, as I said last week, was a really excellent dungeon. It had a wonderful balance of like exploration and scale. It has an immense layout, a pretty complex layout, very easy to get lost in. But I found the balance of combat and the difficulty of enemies in that dungeon to be very appropriate. Like some dungeons I felt were just way too chock full of very difficult enemies in very difficult spaces. And didn't have enough exploration, or vice versa. Like there was some fun exploration, but the enemy situation was just not great. This dungeon, I feel like, strikes a really nice balance of all of those things. And then, of course, ends in not one, but 2 really great boss fights. So giving my award to the Great Palace. Max, how about yourself?
I think I'm going to go with 3 Eye Rock Palace. Which was I guess the second to last one, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So
with Barbara.
Yeah, Barbara. Apparently there's some translation shenanigans that if you look into them enough, you realize Barbara is named Volvagia. It's like the same name, I guess, in Japanese.
Really? That's crazy.
So anyway, so I like this one because it felt like it had it kind of had a good balance where I felt powerful, I felt well equipped, and I felt like the dungeon was throwing a lot of challenges at me that I could overcome with my power and my my good equipment and stuff. So that's one thing, right? I felt equipped to engage with these challenges, and I felt cool and powerful and skilled when I overcame them because they were hard enough. That it had that kind of element to it. I like the boss, right? Its boss feels more like what we think of as a Zelda boss today, where it's a big room size thing. There's some spectacle to it. It's part of the environment. It's not just a flat room. For some reason this dragon had some sweet drapes hanging above it's lava pit, but
it really went for the canopy bed situation.
So I like that about the dragon, and it had mini bosses, right? I think this might be the first of the dungeons that had mini bosses, but
yep, it is. It's actually the only one that has mini bosses.
Yeah, you fight 2 of the Rebonaks, and then it had a lot of Wizrobes or whatever they're called in this one, sorcerers, that I always enjoy fighting. So yeah, it kind of just hit. Oh, and last but not least, it has a puzzle. You have to jump down a pit and turn on your fairy spell in that middle screen before you fall through. And like that's actually something you kind of have to think outside the box to think of to do, which is a classical Zelda puzzle. So,
and it's definitely
high marks.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And it's interesting to me that wasn't something that was tried in other different ways in more of the dungeons. I mean, you have fake walls in a few of them. But I think past what you're talking about, that's really all that there is. And I don't know. I think that they're even with the tools they had available, I think their ability to do extra things of that nature was probably there at the time. And so it kind of has me wondering like why that wasn't leaned into just a little bit more.
Yeah. So for mine, I I'm actually kind of split here. Like the 2 dungeons you both mentioned, I think are great for all the reasons you said, especially Max, your point about first mini boss, first like boss fight that felt like a traditional Zelda boss. The use of mini bosses, like all of that stuff I love about Three-Eyed Rock Palace. But I think my favorite one was probably Ocean Palace, because on a personal note, it was the first dungeon I felt like I got through on skill, not on abusing rewind. And it marked a point for me in this game where I was becoming more comfortable with the mechanics and the combat to a point that I actually noticed progression in myself. And I like Barbara as a boss more than I like Guma. I think I like the layout of Three-Eyed Rock Palace more than Ocean Palace, but for me, Ocean Palace was kind of a turning point in the game personally, where it was still extraordinarily difficult, but it didn't feel like I was beating my head against an unbreakable wall anymore. And so I think for that reason, Ocean Palace gets my vote, because it was a turning point for me personally in this game.
Yeah, that's really great. And I completely agree with you, Matt. Max, this is something I kind of wanted to talk to you about, because in the episode you appeared on earlier in the season, you definitely mentioned that you were experiencing some of the same frustrations as Matt and I were around feeling very not comfortable with the combat, and with the flow of enemy encounters, and like feeling confident in your ability to overcome them. And I know for Matt and I, we both felt like at different points in the back half of the game, we sort of reached that place where we had kind of like we had ridden the learning curve to a point where we were now comfortable with it and actually feeling somewhat competent in all of those things. And the dungeons, of course, are the primary place in which you're developing that skill, right? In the overworld, you've got like enemy encounters and whatnot, but the dungeons are really where you're getting good at this stuff. And so I wanted to ask you, was your journey in the back half of the game towards feeling more comfortable with your ability to like go into a dungeon and just do well there? Like, did that expand quite a lot as you got towards the end?
Yes, it definitely did. Now, I the caveat, of course, is I'm playing on easy mode, right? I'm playing on a modified ROM of the game where I do more, enemies deal less damage and I do more damage. But I can still confidently say that I did get a lot more comfortable with stuff like fighting an iron knuckle and not getting hit, right? Like, which is, it wasn't just that I was tanking it and surviving without losing very much health. I was actually getting skilled enough to not get hit anymore. So I definitely had a lot of skill growth in that way, that made it much more comfortable to just, I reached a point where between those two things, I wasn't having to worry about the battle of attrition that a lot of this game was before that, right? Like, I didn't really have this thing where like, oh no, if I go through this room and I got hit 2 times, I'm not going to have enough health for the next room. I kind of just got to maintain my health generally, as long as I wasn't failing miserably, which I still would do occasionally when I'm fighting like a blue iron knuckle or something. It would take out a lot of my health or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of that too comes from, in the back half of the game, the fact that you have a wider variety of spells to lean on, to kind of like, it becomes a situation where you're able to leverage that spell inventory to deal with these situations more effectively, but also through leveling, you now have the magic capacity to support being able to do that. And I think that really contributes a lot towards the back half of this game having been a lot more fun for me than the front half. And so I completely agree with what you're saying, Max. I want to get back around to this line of discussion in our general thoughts towards the end when we get to our ranking and final thoughts and all that. But I do want to go ahead and move on real quick to the next few parts, which I think are all going to go pretty quickly. Let's get into part 3, which is usually best item. We don't really have items in this game. Like
just
we
best
do.
Spell.
We do, but they're all pretty passive in their in terms of like what they're doing for us. So we're going to call this one Best Spell. I'm just going to ask each of you, starting with Matt, which spell you found to be the most useful and relied on the most.
Jump. Jump was not only useful in traversing the world and in traversing through caves and almost all of the palaces. It is an extraordinarily useful spell to assist in the defeat of Blue Iron Knuckles or the Bird Knights or, whoever else. Like I felt that your best defense was avoidance, and jump made that a lot easier. So yeah, that's my vote.
Cool. How about you, Max?
I am also going to say jump. I kind of have a theme here, actually. I tend to choose the movement and positioning items when you've asked me before. Jump is cool to me because you get it early on, right? So it's one of the spells that becomes cheap enough that you can kind of just use it when you want later on, which a lot of the other spells don't have. Like a lot of them are expensive enough right up to the end that you feel a little bit hesitant to just use them willy-nilly. So you feel like you can use it a lot, and it's versatile. It's useful for both navigation and combat. And in a way, it actually unlocks a whole new dimension of combat, right? Like normally you can only really jump over something that's 2 squares tall, right? And these are pretty tall rooms we're in most of the time, right? There's usually a ton of space that we just aren't able to have any gameplay in because our character can't get up there. But if you use jump, suddenly the whole room is now a gameplay space, assuming the ceiling's tall enough, of course. And it's useful against a variety of different enemies. It can make the difference between a boss battle being hard or, really hard. So I think it's just interesting in a number of ways, more so than most of the other spells, which are generally kind of one-note things.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think this is so difficult because if I'm going to answer this question in terms of like what spell was I using the most, it was heal,
Yeah, I abused heal.
Right. I mean, like, I think that's hands down probably the most generally useful spell in this game, simply because of the way that the health economy works in this game. And obviously, I've got some gripes about that, and I've mentioned them before.
Many.
And, I think that for that reason, the heal spell really is just essential to being able to succeed in this game. Like outside of just becoming a god, which I'm sure a lot of people who love this game and play it a lot are at this point, and rely on that a lot less just because they're great at, dishing damage and not getting hit, but that's not me. And so I definitely was using heal quite a lot. Just in terms of the spell that I thought was the coolest outside of that, I really like the fire spell. I always like shooting fireballs at things, and I really appreciated that was useful against a decent selection of enemies. I feel like in games where we get like the fire rod and stuff like that, it tends to be pretty selective in terms of like who you can and can't use it against. And this one definitely does have some rules in that regard, but like a lot of the enemies that you fight are susceptible to it. And so I thought that one was pretty fun.
Mm-hmm.
I do have one more thought about the heal spell just generally, which is that, again, I think that the health system that was generally happening in this game is not, it's still just not my favorite. I don't love it. I can see a future in which I'm imagining a Zelda game that functions a bit more like a lot of the hero mode Zelda games do, where there are no heart pickups, and healing has to come from other sources. And in that game, if you did have like a magic meter, the way that you do in a lot of the more recent Zelda games, I think it would be cool to have access to a heal spell that was able to like refill your heart containers at the cost of a decent amount of magic. I think that concept in and of itself could be executed on a little bit more successfully in a more modern game, and the loop there could be a little bit more fun. In this game, I think it's such a hassle because, especially early to about 2/3 of the way through the game, you just don't have enough magic to really be able to use heal and also other things that you want to use. Like you've really got to actively not use other stuff because you've got to save that energy to heal your life force. So
yeah, I want to give an honorable mention to the shield spell just because it gives you that awesome looking red tunic. Like I love the color change that it puts on Link and like all of his items. So honorable mention to shield spell just because your what do you call it? Your drip is on point whenever you use it.
Yeah. But I will say again, at the very end of this game, once you've got the magic to really support it, learning how to use all of these different spells in conjunction with each other, depending on whatever need may arise in a particular screen of the dungeon, I thought that was a really fun mechanic. And I actually came away not necessarily feeling like this was worth the trade-off of not having traditional items like boomerangs and bows and arrows and all that kind of thing. But I do think that the spell inventory in and of itself is a cool thing. And
yeah, I think it's a cool concept as well.
Yeah.
I agree that it does not replace items for me. I even didn't necessarily think that Breath of the Wild's limited selection of permanent items, the remote bombs and the magnesis and stuff, outweighed or outperformed the collection of quest items like boomerangs, bow and arrows, hook shots, etc. Like I love those things about Zelda. So having those not be in this game was definitely I noticed their absence quite a lot for sure.
Yep. Totally agreed. Let's move on to part 4, which is best music, where we each give an award for what we thought was the best musical arrangement in the game. I'm going to go first and say that I still don't think I enjoyed any piece of music in this game more than just the base dungeon theme. The Great Palace theme is cool. The overworld theme grew on me a little bit the further that I got into the game. Still don't completely love it, but yeah, the palace theme is really good. I actually would say one of it's in the top 25% of Zelda songs to me. I just think it's like a really well composed piece of music, and anytime I stepped into a dungeon, it kind of gives you that immediate upping of intensity. It really makes you feel like, okay, time to go, time to get in and do a dungeon. And I think that's what some of the best dungeon themes ever made in Zelda do. And I think that this one is, I think it accomplishes that task really well. Matt, how about you? What's your favorite piece of music?
I'm going to just give you an upvote on that and call it good because I agree.
Okay.
Also, its use as the Super Smash Bros. Theme for the Zelda dungeons, Hyrule Castle, and whatever else in Super Smash Bros. Is a big plus for me.
Cool. How about you, Max?
It's a tough call between the dungeon theme and the Great Temple theme, the Great Palace. They're called Temple in the Japanese version. They wanted to call them Palace in the US version to avoid religious connotations, which is ironic considering all the other religious connotations in this game.
Yeah, seriously.
But anyways, yeah, of the two, I do think I land on the same as you two, which is the actual dungeon theme. And I also love it in Smash Brothers.
So
there's a small chance. So they have the Great Temple map in Melee, which is just that's based on the final dungeon. Did you notice that the final dungeon is gold, right? In Adventure of Link, the tile set is gold.
Yep.
In the Japanese version of this game, all the dungeons had the same color or the same tiles, and generally the fewer colors to choose from. So in the Japanese version, I believe the Great Temple is gray, like a lot of the other dungeons are, and that's why the Smash Brothers map is Greystone. If they based it on the US version, that Smash Brothers map would have looked very different.
And that's so interesting to me because as was noted in last week's episode, the Japanese version did have some graphical enhancements over the Western version, especially in the overworld, right? Like the portrayal of like lava and the way that like water moves on the ocean were notably more complex. So it's interesting to me that there was kind of that give and take, right? Where the Japanese version had some better sprite work and some better animation done for some things, but for other things, the palette was a lot more limited.
Yeah, and it was because of technical differences between the Famicom disk system and the NES is what drove a lot of those like ups and downs. Some things were easier on one versus easier on the other.
I was going to ask you a question, Max, while we're talking about music. This is something I've been wondering the last few weeks, and I could have Googled it and gotten an answer, but I wanted to wait until you were on the show and ask you this. Did Koji Kondo do the musical arrangements for this game?
No. I think of the first 6 Zelda games, this is the only one that wasn't composed by Koji Kondo.
I think you can really tell that when you listen to this music. Like it has characteristics to it that are markedly different than anything that Koji Kondo really ever did for this series.
Agreed. Like it sounds utterly unlike what a Zelda soundtrack sounds everywhere else to me.
Yeah, I have to put in an agree on that one as well.
So all that is to say, Koji Kondo, still the greatest of all time. Definitely missed him here.
The GOAT.
All right, let's get on to part 5, which is best bloopy trail normally. And I'm actually going to suggest that the way that we should maybe handle this section is to say that I would advance the theory that the only true bloopy trail in this game is the pursual of grinding out your stats, which is magic, life, and attack, right?
Yeah.
If anybody feels that that's not true, let me know now.
I think that that's accurate. The only other thing you could possibly say is the getting of the magic key, which you don't actually need, but is so helpful to progression. It's sort of a bloopy trail, but not really.
Yeah. Magic key is a good call out. I mean, I guess the other one is the heart containers and magic containers, but those are essentially stats, just a different type of stat.
Well, and magic containers are necessary because you have to have all 8 in order to get the thunder spell, which you have to have in order to beat the Thunderbird.
What a nightmare if you get to the Thunderbird and you don't have
Dude,
that.
I can't imagine that. I would have raged.
Such a big trail of you have to go back and do.
That would have been awful.
If you missed out.
So, knowing that we all kind of agree on my basic premise here, my question then becomes: do we all feel like the grind to kind of fill out these stats was appropriately fun as like a secondary consideration for this game?
No.
Okay.
I mean, that's just my opinion. I was just thought we were voicing opinions here.
No, so. I mean, I asked and you answered.
Yeah,
I don't know what I expected.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be fun. Like there were times when I enjoyed taking a few minutes to like finish off a level. It's kind of a change of pace. Do I think it was as good as it should have ideally been? No, there should have been optional stuff. There should have been exploration you could do. Like, but that's partly my bias as a person who likes exploration in Zelda games talking.
Yeah. And I want to clarify, I don't think that it's a bad system. I don't think it's an unfun system. I think that it does not replace bloopy trails for me. Like bloopy trails are one of the main aspects of most Zelda games that we enjoy sinking hours of gameplay into, right? Like that is what keeps you coming back to Zelda in a lot of ways, is doing those memorable side quests, the hand in the toilet, the gratitude crystals, the, whatever else you want to call it, just exploring Breath of the Wild to find Easter eggs.
Well, and even in Zelda 1, like the quest to find hidden nooks and crannies. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Old or new Kasuto.
I was going to say that.
Almost optional.
Yeah, I was going to say that, Max, was like the biggest thing that the biggest dopamine rush related to bloopy trails that I got from this game was finding new Kasuto town in the woods. Like that was cool. That was a really cool moment. But it was a necessary one, so it's not a bloopy trail because you have to go there.
Yeah.
And it's stuff like that this game lacks that is hard for me to overcome my prejudice of newer Zelda games having all of these things that this game just does not have. And I'm sure Josh is like raging against us while he's listening to this episode. But I really just didn't feel like this game performed to that level of expectation.
Yeah.
I guess a couple spells were optional. Technically, the life spell and the shield spell are optional.
Nope. A shield spell, yes.
I guess
reflect.
yes. You do not technically need either of those things to beat the game.
But good luck.
Yeah. Seriously. Reflect. I thought you meant reflect, which is why I kind of disagreed. But no, your shield itself. Yeah, you don't necessarily.
Yeah, like woe on the person who chooses to just not get those. So
and those spells had associated quests, essentially, right? Like there was always a little tiny side quest feeling thing you had to do to get the spells.
Yeah.
I guess my answer would also be that even though I found it to be a fun pursuit to try and grind these things out and to fill in those, those extra progress bars and whatnot, like I don't think that in and of itself it is a satisfying extra gameplay loop on top of the core things that you're doing. I agree with you, Matt. I'm really missing a lot of the extraneous exploration stuff that every other Zelda game, including the one before this, has. So there you go. Well, with that out of the way, let's get on to the main event, which is our ranking and discussion about our ranking.
Before we do that, can I pull a Cody Davies and insert a section?
Go for it.
Do it.
Awesome. Okay, so there were two things I want to talk about. One of them is really short, which is that there's this perception amongst Zelda fans now that Adventure of Link is not a beloved game. That people don't really like it. It's the black sheep of the Zelda family. And in a lot of ways that's true now. But at the time it came out, Adventure of Link was critically and commercially successful. I went back and I looked up a bunch of reviews and previews from the time period. I found old magazine scans and stuff. I enlisted a few people to help me find some of these.
So you did actually dig up some non-Nintendo sponsored contemporary reviews of this game.
I did. And they're generally pretty glowing. This was a AAA blockbuster, the biggest game of the year. People looked forward to it for a year ahead of time kind of game when it came out. And they loved it, and it was lauded as one of the greatest adventures you could have on the NES, and it's a vast world you can explore, and big there's NPCs and a story to experience. People really appreciated what it brought to the table at the time. And for a while afterwards, for years afterwards, I found somebody, there's a guy named Mac, M-A-K, or also known as Game Master Matt, he's a bigger Zelda historian than I am. He knows more than I do. And he helped me dig up a bunch of this stuff. And he kind of showed me that there were magazine polls and Nintendo Power, which was just subscriber polls every month about what their favorite games were. And, Adventure of Link was in the top 30 for 10 years. Many years afterwards, it was still in that top 30 list. And the same was true in votes in other magazines. So I thought that was interesting because it flies in the face of the common feeling towards this game.
Well, and that makes me wonder if actually I have a thought on this that I want to get into post ranking. I want to expound on this more.
Okay.
But so remind me when we get there.
Will do. And so the second thing I want to talk about is a little bit of a bigger topic. Do you remember last time I said I wanted to talk about why this game is similar to Skyward Sword?
Yes.
Why do you have to hurt me?
Negative thing.
Okay.
This is not a negative thing.
Okay, fine.
But I'm going to do a little bit of a preamble to kind of give some context for why I say this. So, most games start off with a couple core ideas. It's the theme of the game that all the other ideas flow from, or the thesis of the game, you might say. So the way game dev works is usually like maybe the thesis is a story. Like maybe you're making an RPG or a visual novel and you're like, I want to tell a story about X or Y. Or maybe the thesis is you are a lawyer and you need to point out contradictions in trials, and then you go and make Ace Attorney games. Or, it could be anything. Like sometimes it's an art, like a visual image people have. Sometimes it's a gameplay thing. But the way game dev works is nobody can keep an entire game in their head from the beginning, right? Nobody just has a vision pop in that has every element there. It's kind of this iterative thing where they make decision after decision after decision every day, working towards, ideally, a goal that is relatively unfixed. It's not changing. That's like their North Star, right? So every decision they make is in service of reaching whatever this North Star is. I found some quotes from Tadashi Sugiyama, who is the game director of Adventure of Link, where he says that Adventure of Link started off not as a Zelda game. It was originally an action adventure game or a side-scrolling action game that didn't have the Zelda IP attached to it, and their goal was to make a sword fighting game. So that was kind of the genesis of Zelda 2, was they were making prototypes of a sword fighting side-scrolling game. And every design decision they made, to an extent at least, was about like, how do we make a game that really emphasizes sword fighting? And then they put Zelda on it after they left pre-production or whatever they would have called it at the time. They were like, okay, we're gonna put the Zelda IP on this, and then they of course did stuff to embrace Zelda in it. But I think it's super interesting because you can trace a lot of what's weird about Zelda 2. You can trace back to this goal of making a sword fighting game. Obviously, the sword fighting combat, right, in the side-scrolling sections, like that's obviously about that goal, right? It's you stand in place, and the way you swing your sword, the timing of swinging your sword is kind of the gameplay, the combat system. But you can also look at stuff like the spell system, and the way they design spells instead of having items is because of this sword fighting goal. Because their sword fighting system required the use of both buttons. There wasn't an extra button to press for items. So what I think happened was they were like, okay, Zelda has this whole thing where there's like items you can get and stuff, but we can't put it on either of these buttons. What do we do? So they came up with the spells that you can cast with select, but it doesn't work super well to have like an action, like swinging a weapon or something, or firing a bow with the select button, because you have to take your hand off of the D-pad. So they didn't really want items that are like real-time combat items. So they did buffs or status changing spells, which all the spells except for Thunder or whatever it's called are, right? They're always like this thing that you do that provides a lasting benefit or it refills your health, and it's not really timing sensitive during combat. So like that's because of the sword fighting system being their core goal. And the overworld being an overworld map. I'm guessing that they were originally going to make just a side-scrolling game, like something like Kid Icarus or Metroid or something, maybe Castlevania. And they probably were like, when they decided to put Zelda on it, I'm guessing what happened was they're like, oh crap, Zelda is about traversing a large land, but that doesn't really work with side-scrolling for us. So overworld happens. And there's a million little things like that you kind of trace in that way when you evaluate any game. And so that brings me back to my original point, which is, what is the only other Zelda game that had sword fighting combat as its primary goal?
That would be Skyward Sword, of course.
I think it's a really interesting connection to draw. I think with Skyward Sword, it's so fascinating because you still have you still have that whole system. Like, what is the most accurate 1-to-1, combat system that we can produce? And then it's in addition to all of these other things that are mainstays of Zelda, right? Like, combat action items and stuff like that. And of course, that's because, if for no other reason, we have more buttons now. Yay. But it does make me think, like, we've talked a lot. I know we've talked about this with you, Max, in past games. We've talked about it with other folks. Like, I still never exactly come to Zelda games for the purpose of engaging with a combat simulator, right? That's never my primary goal in getting into these games. And I'm not gonna say that I don't think there's anyone in the world who, like, comes to them for that, looking for that, right? But if those people are out there, then I would say to them that there's probably other and better franchises to get it from, So I don't know. Like, I respect the goal and I respect the ambition. I just think that, if nothing else, what this is telling me is that it's confirming to me that this is not the pillar around which Zelda in its most effective form should be completely based. And I think Skyward Sword is maybe even it's maybe an example that sort of proves that rule to me, which is that even though it has that, and even though it is a huge part of that game, the most distinctive part of that game, the fact that it exists alongside other enduring, consistent Zelda conventions, it's fun because it's there in addition to those things. It's not fun simply because it has that, right?
Right.
What do you think, Matt?
I love. So I want to say that, obviously, technical limitations and eras of gaming and coding aside, like, a sword fighting simulator based in the Zelda universe sounds really awesome to me. Maybe not as a mainline Zelda game, but as like a Hyrule Warriors offshoot, sort of. Not in the way that Hyrule Warriors did it, because that's more of a Ninja Gaiden, like, hack and slash. But, like, I would love to see a more dedicated sword fighting the way that Skyward Sword did it, because I do love that concept. I don't think Zelda as a series should revolve around sword fighting as its primary mechanic. I think what you said is accurate, Lyndon, that sword fighting in Skyward Sword being one of my favorite things about that game, it really works best because it is in supplement to the rest of what makes Zelda unique and special. And I think that that's fair. I don't think that sword fighting as a primary mechanic in Adventure of Link works for me.
I think that existing at the expense of these other things
exactly
is not
it doesn't do it for me. You're absolutely right.
Are you kind of with us on that, Max?
Yeah. I definitely am. I do want to clarify that I do think Skyward Sword has amazing combat. Probably my favorite of the series. But yes, I agree with pretty much everything you guys are saying.
Hooray! We got Max to say something positive about Skyward Sword. Woo! Let's bookmark it.
He said a lot of positive things about Skyward Sword when we played that game.
I know, but I still have to give him crap because
this is the feud that isn't actually a feud, but is nevertheless now, like, part of the lore of this podcast.
Absolutely, we have to keep it going at every opportunity. Yes. And to clarify, Max Nichols and I are great friends, even though we have we have different ideology about that specific game. So there is no actual feud for anybody.
No animosity. Yay.
Yeah. So don't be worried about it. Yeah. We're good.
But so that's super interesting. And I definitely see why game developers at the time, especially given that there was only one game in this series at the time, and they was still kind of being established, like, what Zelda is, right? I could definitely see a room of people brainstorming about what their game should be, thinking it sounded really cool to just try and make it the best sword simulator that was like available at the time. You know, I totally get why somebody would think that that's like a really cool thing. But as with so many of the other thoughts that I have about Zelda 2, it's difficult for me to judge those decisions completely in a vacuum, absent my thoughts and feelings about what makes this series work really well as a whole. Like what are the reasons that I think Zelda is the mega force in gaming that it is? And it, like, I just cannot put that historical knowledge aside. And so I can respect the intention. I definitely see where that idea has like merit and a cool factor to it. But yeah, definitely glad that was not like maintained as the primary thing around which all future Zelda games should revolve. So yeah, that's just where I'm at with it. So with all of that being said, we've talked a lot about how we feel about a lot of disparate parts of this game, our opinions and feelings about a lot of different things, but let's put it all together. We do that, of course, in part 6 of the Sacred Realms recap, which is our final thoughts and ranking. And so what I want to do is I want to go ahead and get the ranking out of the way first, and then kind of have a discussion about why we feel it deserves that ranking, and then maybe also add some extra nuance on top of that, because I know that I personally have some very nuanced feelings about how I got to this determination, and also how I feel about the game as a whole. So I don't think that we necessarily have a reason to do the whole system with hands and the lowering of hands and whatnot. Can we all agree that this game is going to come in at the bottom of our current ranking?
Yep.
Yeah. So, yeah, definitely that's where I'm at as well. So the ranking as it stands now is number 7, The Adventure of Link; number 6, The Legend of Zelda; number 5, A Link to the Past; number 4, Link's Awakening; number 3, Skyward Sword; number 2, Ocarina of Time; number 1, Breath of the Wild. I don't think that anybody truly expected this game to fall anywhere else on this list. But I do want to say that even though, you know, this game is now at the bottom of our list and is probably going to remain there. I mean, who knows? But I would be willing to bet it's probably going to stay there. I still came away from this game, like once credits rolled, once it was complete and I had finished the whole thing, I really did come away from this game feeling like, regardless of all of these things that kept me from enjoying it as much as everything else on this list, I still found a lot that I admire and enjoy about this game. There are a lot of things that I think contributed to me still having a good time while I was playing it. But yeah, it just does not, I think at the end of the day, hit enough of those main pillars of what I look for in a Zelda game to be any higher than this. Max, how about yourself?
Yeah, I largely agree with a lot of that. I think this is probably going to be the last time you have a recap episode where you don't rate a game at least one step up.
I think you're right.
Which I think is a fun milestone for you to hit. Yeah, I mean, did you want me to go into general thoughts beyond that right now?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I kind of what I'm looking for right now is just like, so we all agree where this game should be ranked. I guess let's kind of have an overall discussion about the game as a whole product and why we feel it deserves to be here.
Gotcha. Yeah, so I mean, for me, a lot of it boils down to the fact that it is aged badly. I think it's interesting historically that it was received positively at the time, and I think that's important context. And I think it's interesting that it affected the series in a lot of ways outside of the mechanical, like in terms of portrayal and the writing style and like some symbols that are used afterwards. So there is like cool stuff that happened because this game existed, but it was never going to be anything other than the lowest game on this list, because there are parts of it that are just miserable to play. for a modern player right now, and we are living in the year 2022. It's too hard. It's obtuse. It has
obtuse. There's the O word. Yeah.
Requirements. It's difficult on too many axes. It has harsh punishment for failure. It has arcade sensibilities around difficulty design. It's just not a good game by modern standards in any way. Whereas Zelda 1 still was something I think a lot of modern players could enjoy without having to like psych themselves up into like a 1986 mindset. So
yeah. I mean, no, no, I mean that's all true, and to me, it's kind of a story of frustrations, right? Because even though I agree with all of those things, and I do feel all of those things, there is a smattering of, I think, very well executed gameplay here. I think that even though a lot of it is archaic and overly difficult, and it's just definitely not up to par for what we would consider to be a universally enjoyable game in the modern age. I do see elements of things in here that I thought were very satisfying. I think the biggest one to me, honestly, I mentioned it earlier, but just like, I think that the learning curve of this game is actually really well implemented. And I think that's subjective.
I need you to reiterate that. You think the learning curve in Adventure of Link is well done?
Well, yeah. I mean, like, by the time I got to the end of this game, I felt like I had become competent at it. Mm-hmm. And like, I feel like it had given me sufficient opportunity to get better at it. And there was satisfaction in the getting better. Right. Like, I think that, I don't know, like, I think even though it is overly difficult, I don't get me wrong. I think that some tuning is definitely required if we want this game to be the best version of itself, right? Like, I think everything you said is true, Max. Like, difficulty on too many axes, too harsh punishment for failure, all these things, they're all true. But I did, at the end of the day, get a lot of satisfaction out of getting better at this game, and I felt like the game did give me opportunities to get better, you know? And that's not nothing. Like, that's a big part of why I play any difficult game, right? Like, on a smaller scale, implemented, less gracefully, of course, but like that's the same reason that people play Souls games, That's the same reason that I played kind of like Hyper Light Drifter and stuff, Like, these are all hyper difficult games, and the experience of getting better at them can be a very rewarding way to invest your time. And I'm not saying that, like, I'm not saying that this is a fair game by any stretch of the imagination, but I still got that feeling from it. And I've got to give it props for that. But again, I have to admit that is a very subjective judgment. Like, this is something that is going to vary wildly from player to player. And given Matt's, tone and asking me that question just now, I'm going to pass it to you, Matt. I'm assuming that you disagree.
Yeah, I don't think that the learning curve was well implemented in this game at all, because I think that the first dungeon we played was like a pretty good first dungeon, and then the difficulty ramped to 1,000,000 out of the gate. And I don't think that you can have that spike in difficulty that early in the game and it be a good learning curve. I totally agree with your point about by the end of the game, I felt like I was there, and I felt like I was doing better, and I felt like I had learned, and I felt like I had grown, which, we talked a lot about at the beginning of this episode. But I don't think it was well implemented because it goes from 0 to 100 so fast. There is no gradient. There's no curve. It's a spike. And I don't think that that's good game design. I don't think that that's good, at least for the modern time. And to Max's point, it has arcade sensibility, which is just incredible difficulty so that you spend more time on it. And today, that's not how games are. And I think that's for the better, right? I don't think that I personally, as a near 30-year-old person with a job and a significant other and a bunch of other things. Like, I don't have time to sit here and beat my head against an unbeatable wall for 12 hours on a weekend to progress one level. And I don't think that is a good mechanic. I don't think it's a good system. By the end of the game, I was kind of there, but we talked about it, I think 2 or 3 episodes ago. Like, we got drug along this learning curve by the root of our hair, kicking and screaming because we had to. And to me, that means that it was not a well implemented system.
And the thing that makes this complicated is that, again, the version of this game that we were playing had so much baked in forgiveness just by virtue
because
of
we could rewind.
Yeah. And so it is worth mentioning. The big caveat to all of this is that I still cannot comprehend playing this game in its original form on an NES cart, right? Like, I just can't conceive of that.
And I would even say that, like, I got so tired of rewinding. Like, I did. I tried very hard not to crutch on that, especially as we progressed in the last 3 dungeons. I tried very hard to be intentional about not doing it every time I got hit by an iron knuckle or every time I even died. But I also was not going to let myself game over on Eastern Hyrule and then have to go all the way back over there. And I mean, I just don't know. I think Max said it best, that the game just has not aged well. I think that is a very accurate assessment.
So here's what this discussion really comes down to. The crux, like the establishing premise of our entire podcast, is the judgment that we kind of rendered at the very beginning of all of this, which was that we do not believe that a bad Nintendo-made Zelda game exists. Like, that was our establishing premise for this podcast. And so what I think the real discussion here is not where do we rank this game, because we all know, everyone knows it's at the bottom. The real discussion is, do we think that a bad Nintendo-made Zelda game exists in Adventure of Link?
No, I don't think that they made a bad game. And I think that is evident in the fact that for its time, to Max's point just a few minutes ago, it was hugely successful. It has set up a lot of things that have carried into future Zelda games. It set up a lot of the foundational lore of the Zelda universe. I don't think it's a bad game. I think that it is not a game I will replay. And it's not a game that I particularly enjoyed all the way through. There were things about it that I did enjoy, but I don't think it's a bad game. It's not my personal flavor of gaming, right? I think that you cannot say that it's a bad game with how commercially successful it was, how well reviewed it was at its time. It is a product of its time. It is just this is almost the epitome of NES gaming for me. This and the Return of the Jedi NES.
That was SNES.
SNES. Yeah, I mean, still same concept though, right? Just difficult.
Yeah.
Like, this is a product of that time and a product of that design philosophy. So for what it was at the time and what it represented, I think it was successful in doing what it set out to do, and it set up a whole franchise, really, that we have now enjoyed 18-ish, 13 games. So I can't call it a bad game. And I don't want to call it a bad game. I just want to make that clear. I don't want to call it a bad game. I don't think that it is. There are a lot of things I don't like about it, but I don't think that it was a bad game.
What do you think, Max? Does our establishing premise hold out?
I think so. I mean, good or bad is highly contextual, right? And subjective. I think this game is good in the same way that Steamboat Willie was good. Right? Like, it was breaking new ground. It was blowing minds at its time. And it feels like if you were to show it to a kid, 11 years old or something, and they don't care about historical context, they only compare it to what they experience now, they'd be like, no, that's crappy. Why are you showing me this? That may not actually be true for Steamboat Billy, but I think it would be true for Adventure of Link. And that's fine, right? It would be a game out of time to try to show it to people right now, and have them compare it to, I don't know, the new God of War that just came out or whatever. It's not the same thing. It's not the same audience. It's not the same goals. But when it came out, it was amazing. And I can't call something bad just because it's no longer in its original context.
Well, and even among peers of its time, I mean, this is still, for all intents and purposes, a relatively polished product. I mean, when you go back to the NES and the SNES, you've got some broken games on those systems.
Oh yeah, it was surrounded by hot garbage everywhere, except for in some other Nintendo made games, right? And a few like standouts from like Square Enix, or well, Square and Enix were separate companies at the time, but whatever, you get the point. A lot of real bad stuff on the NES.
Yeah.
And this is not that.
No, I agree. I think that I think that our premise holds true, and if it holds true now, then I think we can pretty confidently say that we're not going to feel differently, on any other game that we're going to play throughout the rest of us doing this. But like, I think I agree with y'all. It is definitely not a bad game. It's not a great game. It's not an all-timer to me. It's not enduring in the same way that a lot of others are. When you look at The Legend of Zelda before it and then A Link to the Past after it, those games are timeless in certain ways, They, like, even The Legend of Zelda is timeless in a variety of ways, like you mentioned earlier, Max. And I just don't think that this game is ever going to be that. It is a good game. It is a fine game. It is not a spectacular game. It's not a wonderful game. But yeah, definitely would not call it bad. Yeah.
So I want to move us to a couple listener questions that we've got on Discord that I think supplement this discussion pretty well. Number one is
this is going to be a 2.5 hour episode, by the way.
Yeah, I mean,
that just seems like the most appropriate way to end the adventure of Link on this podcast.
What enemy was too strong and which of them were too weak? And like, did that affect your enjoyment of combat in this game?
Max, do you have any? Do you have one that you could put forward for that?
No, I don't have a strong answer offhand. Thinking about it, if one of you wants to go.
I mean, too weak is. I mean, no enemy is too weak. I'll take an easy kill anytime I can get it.
I'll take the blue blots.
Yeah.
Every day of the week.
I think to me, too strong is still definitely just the blue iron knuckles, right? Like,
yes.
And I think I've said this before. A lot of that really just comes down to the areas of the game in which they make us fight these guys.
Yeah.
Just, man, there's nothing in the world that I hated doing in this game more than getting into a low ceilinged room with one blue iron knuckle, and that low ceiling takes up the entire stretch of the screen that I can see before me, and knowing that I'm going to have to fight this guy while not being able to take advantage of like jump or whatever. So yeah, I think that's definitely probably my answer. I don't think anything was harder to me than the blue iron knuckles.
Yeah, I'm gonna give an upvote on the blue iron knuckle there.
I do have to give credit where credit is due, though. I found the majority of the boss encounters to actually be very fair and well designed.
Yeah, I thought the boss encounters were pretty good. I thought the reusing of smack it in the head was got a little tropish, but other than that, I did enjoy for the most part bosses in this game.
Well, smack it in the head was the precursor to shoot it in the eye.
Exactly.
And that's like we've been doing that for 30 years.
Yeah,
so
no, it's still around for sure. I actually do also want to say that I thought the iteration of Iron Knuckles into Bird Knights in the Final Palace was kind of cool. I actually enjoyed that, watching them create a new enemy that was similar to an Iron Knuckle but different in mechanics.
Yeah,
and I liked that.
Yeah. Max, did you have anything you wanted to pitch in on that? It's okay if not.
I think I ultimately have the same answer you two do, which is the blue iron knuckles. I mean, they made me quit and start over on an entirely different version of the game.
Yeah, that's when you know you're in rough shape. So next one here that I want to call out is we already talked about kind of last week about the ending, whether or not it was satisfying. I think overall we kind of think it was as good of an ending as it could be for a game of this era. But a good question here is could they have achieved more or less had this been a true top-down like Link to the Past or Legend of Zelda instead of a big overworld with intercutting on side-scrolling? Do you think this game would have been better or worse for that?
Well, so I don't know. That's a complicated question. If you look at it from the perspective of could this same story have been told maybe more effectively in that format, then yeah, sure, why not? Like the exact same story beats could have been achieved doing the same sort of overworld and dungeon style as The Legend of Zelda and A Link to the Past and all the other ones after that. Mm-hmm. Like if you're just breaking it down in terms of like Link has to go to 7 or however many dungeons and deposit crystals after beating a boss, then I mean, yeah, hell yeah, why not? Like like that's what we're doing in all these other games. So yes, we could have done that. I think that the other side of this question is it even the same game anymore?
Yeah.
If you're not side-scrolling combat, if you don't have this, the overworld is a separate thing to me, because to me that was the most extraneous and easily like dismissible part of this whole game.
Yep.
So I don't know how you solve for that in a side-scrolling manner. Right? Because the only other way you can do this is like the overworld is like it was in Zelda 1, but then the dungeons are side-scrolling, but then that makes no sense because you're doing combat in the overworld. And so why wouldn't you be doing it the same way in the dungeons?
So yeah, I think you just have a whole different game if you make this into a top-down. Like it's not the same game anymore.
I think the interesting angle is maybe if you're like, okay, you keep a lot of the same elements and the same goals, right? The goal of it being a sword fighting game, the goals of having the structure of an overworld with dungeons that are separate screens, towns, maybe more or less the same story. Like if you try to keep a lot of those things and then redesign it as a top-down game, arguably it's kind of the same. There's some of the same bones to it. And I think they would have not achieved their goals as well. With the same goals, I don't think those goals would have been achieved as strongly with a top-down 2D game.
Because the whole thing is that the ability to do vertical combat is essential to their stated purpose in this game, right?
I think that if they had made it 2D, they would have had to have different goals. And then at that point, it's just a very different game.
Yeah. So
sorry, top down.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right. And kind of on the back of that, I know Lyndon and I talked a little bit last week about if we were to redesign the game as a remake, like what would be changed? And I know most of our answers were around reduction of the famine economy and a gentler skill creep curve. But Max, I just want to let you have an opportunity to kind of put anything here. Like if you were to remake this game, keeping it true to the original as much as possible, like are there any big points you would change, and what would those be?
Yeah, so for Zelda 1, I thought it couldn't really be remade without becoming a very different game. It was just too simple, too focused. It was already like basically the best version of what it was.
Yep, agree.
Zelda 2, I have a totally opposite opinion where I think it could keep the same bones and same gameplay and same structure and be a lot better with polish and better visuals and just a lot more love poured into it. So I actually do think this could be remade and it would benefit a lot for it in a whole bunch of ways. Biggest one, of course, being difficulty balancing. But like I think you could expand this game in a lot of ways. Like you could add side quests, you could add more NPC dialogue, you could do stuff like setting towns as your new respawn points when you get a game over instead of going all the way back to North Castle. Like there's just endless details you could do like that while keeping the same game at its core.
And it's tough for me because I've been thinking about this a lot too, and I agree with you, Max. And at the same time, every time I think, how would I remake this game? Like if I was going to do it and it was going to be the same basic sort of game experience as this one. I'm not trying to make it into a top down. I'm not trying to do this or that. I'm making it a side scrolling combat game with an overworld, right? I just keep coming back to, would that basically just be like a Zelda Metroid, you know, which this kind of is. But like my recent experience with Metroid Dread, especially, has got me thinking a lot about the ways in which like that style of game, you know, could be. There's some polishing of combat ability and movement in Metroid Dread versus what you can do in like Super Metroid, for instance. And I think similar principles could be applied to this game. You know, I think that it would still be pretty different, right? Because it would not be one persistent side-scrolling world. I think you would need to find some way to retain the overworld to side-scrolling temple balance, and then the combat itself, I think, would still be a bit more. It would be slower paced than what you find in a Metroid title, right? So I don't think it would just be Metroid but Zelda.
Yeah.
But I do think if there ever was to be a remake for this game, and I don't think that there will be, but hey, who knows? I think that it would take a lot of learnings from Metroid Dread in its combat sections. And I think it could still have a pretty distinct flavor, even with that being the case.
Yeah. So last one here, while I go turn the lights back on, I'll let you guys wax philosophical about this one, is what is something about the game that you found yourselves enjoying more than you expected?
Yeah, there's a couple things. I mean, the biggest one is the combat, right? Like by the end of the game, I was actually enjoying the combat a lot. And the maneuvering in combat. And I didn't really know that was going to happen because it didn't feel amazing when I first started. But once I got used to it, it was a lot of fun. So that was surprising and serendipitous. And then I would also say the world of Hyrule. I didn't expect to be as happy with this kind of no gameplay overworld structure that it has, as I ended up feeling like it was actually okay. And did a lot of cool stuff for the series because it existed. So like that's another example.
Will you restate the question real quick, Matt?
Yeah, what was something that you found yourself enjoying more about this game than you thought you would?
So I already alluded to this a little bit. The combat learning curve was something that I definitely enjoyed a little bit more. I think that even though it's definitely still true that combat is not what I come to Zelda games for in and of itself, I think that in this situation, it was something that I had a good time sinking my teeth into, you know, and I found that to be surprising. I think when I got into this game at the beginning, I was expecting to write it off as a failure and something that I didn't enjoy simply because it was side-scrolling, and that was not what I come to Zelda for. But I do think that the side-scrolling combat system did have some legs, and I did enjoy interacting with it. It was definitely not like a toss it in the bin sort of feeling that I thought I was going to have. And in addition to that, I really think that, again, I was not expecting any cool story out of this game. I was really not expecting to enjoy the narrative at all. And I did, like I will now, I can now comfortably put the story of this game and slot it into the overarching lore of Zelda and like enjoy thinking and speculating about it in the similar way that I do other games in the series. And I think that's a big deal, I mean, like we one of the big reasons that we keep coming back to this series is because it's fun to try and like hypothesize about the lore and to speculate about the ramifications of like timeline and all that stuff. And I think that this game gives us plenty of fuel to add to that conversation. And that's a win. I put that in the win column in a big way.
For sure. I think for me, I ended up enjoying I enjoyed the spell system more than I thought I would. Admittedly, as I've already stated, not as much as items, but I thought the spells were implemented pretty well. Passive buffs to your combat ability are pretty neat. Lyndon, I think your point about just the lore being actually impactful to the overall story of Zelda in general is pretty cool, and not something I expected to see happen from this era of game. And I don't even really think it was something that The Legend of Zelda can say outside of just being the first. I think Adventure of Link makes a lot more strides in lore implication than Legend of Zelda does, just by nature of what it introduces, the nature of the Triforce, the nature of Link, the naming of Zelda, it goes into a lot of those things that become staples throughout the series. So, have to definitely give it props there. And I definitely did find myself enjoying the side scrolling a lot more than I thought. And I have to honestly give a little bit of credit to Metroid Dread for prepping me to enjoy this type of game, this type of combat, because I have not played a lot of side scrollers outside of Metroid Dread. And so like going into it, it wasn't nearly as off-putting as it could have been, having had that experience. So what you said about like, could you just have like a Metroid-esque Zelda game? I think there's a space for that somewhere, and I wouldn't be opposed to playing that. And, I'm there.
The big takeaway from this episode is that Metroid Dread is great, and you should all play it.
Metroid Dread is so good. It's a phenomenal game. Yeah. So yeah, that is. Hold on, I think we have one
is that
more.
Yeah.
Nope, that was it. That was our listener questions for today.
Much appreciated to everyone who wrote in with those. I know, I think that the community has really been enjoying the conversation around this game, and really been enjoying the wide variety of takes and opinions and everything. And I love that. I just love that. Honestly, now that we're kind of at the end of season 6, particularly at the end of Adventure of Link, I love the variety of conversation that we've been able to have around this game. I think that it's truly been some of the most fun podcasting we've been able to do so far, because some things like, Ocarina of Time and Breath of the Wild and all these, it's still very fun to talk about those games, but it's all sort of kind of like a given that
they're amazing and wonderful, and we have glowing things to say.
Yeah, they're a known quantity for all of us, right? And that's not to say that it's not worthy to kind of like break down why that is, but this game gave us something very different, which was an opportunity to really dig into, as Max, as you said earlier, something that is considered to be the black sheep of this series.
And I think it's been really great to have a nuanced discussion about it, right? Like, it's easy to come on here and say, I don't like this, I don't like that. It's a lot harder to dig into why don't I like that, or why does this not work in today's world, but it did work back then. Like, it's the ability and the breadth that our community has kind of given us to dive into these topics that has been really awesome for this season in particular, is looking back at some games that are maybe didn't age as well, or, things that we don't like about them, and being able to have a discussion about that instead of just the statement of I don't like or I do like getting into the meat of the tension points there is really what has created probably our longest season yet. As far as amount of game to play versus amount of pod that was created, there's just so much here to talk about, because it's important to give context to that stuff, because as we have always stated, is we want to be as objective as possible about these games, and we still don't believe that any bad Zelda game has ever been made. So it's important to talk about that stuff.
Yep. Max, do you have anything else that you want to say about Zelda 2 before we kind of tie this episode up and, go on our merry way and fire up our Wii U's to play Wind Waker? Or I guess you're playing it on GameCube. But
only that trying to imagine a world where this was the foundation all the future games learned from more than Zelda 1.
God,
is a very interesting and different world.
That's what
we probably don't have time to dig into.
No.
Right
But that's what I was going to say earlier. When I was like, I have a thought and I want you to remind me, and I forgot to do that. But anyway, my whole thing is, do you think that this game is looked back on more favorably if A Link to the Past is not the version of Zelda that kind of went forward after this, right? Like, because basically after this game, they had two versions of Zelda to choose from. You could go left or right. You could continue your series in the vein of Zelda 1, or you could continue it in the vein of Zelda 2. And if it had gone the other way, I don't know, like, you're right. That's so hard to like hypothesize about. That's like such a, like, I mean, who can even say? But like, I don't know. I just think it's so tough for me because so many of my opinions about this game really are rooted in what Zelda games after this did and why I love those games,
Yeah. Like, the sort of people who would be doing a podcast looking back on it would be people with a totally different taste. Like,
it may not be us.
Like everything about the context that we'd be looking at it now would be different. We'd be nostalgic about different things. We'd be probably different people. Maybe the Zelda series would have died out 10 years ago. Like, I don't know, the F-Zero and Metroid franchises did. Metroid came back, but like, maybe that's a world where the Zelda series isn't industry defining over and over again like it actually was. Like, there's so much different about it.
It's an interesting.
Yes, I think the long standing answer is yes. People would look on it more favorably because it wouldn't be a black sheep. It would be the start.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought exercise, if nothing else. And that's all it ever will be because we went right instead of left, and the rest of the Zelda series went a completely different direction. And I, for one, am thankful for that. But anyway. Well, this has been a super fun discussion, y'all. I mean, seriously, I knew it was going to be. I am very, very happy that, for one, I'm very happy that we're not playing these games in chronological order, because if we had, then we would have started this towards the very front, and we would not have had quite as many established recurring guests to like come on and have these incredible conversations about it. Like, I'm very happy that we're playing this game now, and that we have all these great folks that that we know have got great nuanced perspectives to come on and like add to that conversation. So really, I think we've got one more episode left in season 6. Next week, we're going to do a bonus episode with, some returning favorites, where we talk about, where we kind of like put a cap on our thoughts on the 8-bit era of Zelda. But, this is the end of the main run of season 6. And I just want to say that I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
This has been one of the more enjoyable podcast seasons we've done.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think I love the games as much. Obviously, they've fallen to the bottom of our ranking. But as far as quality of discussion, volume of discussion, quality of guests, which are as always phenomenal, we are just supremely blessed with amazing guests that we have on here. And you being one of those, Max, of course. And I think that this has been really a standout season for us as podcasters and content creators. And I'm very glad that we're here now. And I'm also very proud to now say that I am in those legion of Zelda people who have played these two games and beaten them. And I could not say that before. So really, at the end of it all, I'm glad to have had this experience and glad to have been doing this podcast for this experience.
Absolutely. So, y'all ready to play some Wind Waker?
I am so ready to play some Wind Waker.
I can't wait. Oh, God, I'm so jacked. We've already started lining up guests and scheduling all those episodes. So, yeah, season 7 is going to be a banger, and I just can't wait. Well, I think...
7.
What?
You said season 6. It's season 7.
Oh, damn it. Yeah, season 7 is going to be... Well, season 6 was a banger. Season 7 will be yet another banger. We're lining up the bangers here. I can't wait. It's going to be a great time. Max, seriously, thank you so much for coming back on. Honestly, like, having you on the Rank and Recap episodes for these two most historic of Zelda titles has added a lot just because of your like wealth of knowledge around, developer like attitudes and goals and like the historical knowledge that you have. So we really appreciate you coming on to kind of help us round out our thoughts on these games.
Yeah, I mean, I have loved both these recap episodes. They've been a blast to guest on. I'd like taking this broad view over these games. So thanks for having me again.
Absolutely. And of course, everyone knows this isn't the last time you'll be hearing from Max Nichols. He's going to come back on to talk about Wind Waker. It's going to be a great time. Of course, we're going to have many more guests to come on talk about that game. Some returning favorites who haven't been on in a while. Talk to Kylie Parker today. She's going to come on. It's going to be a great time.
Woot woot.
Love it. All right. Well, now we are officially over the 2.5 hour mark. So I think that means it's time to wrap this thing up and get out of here. Does that sound about right to you, Matt?
It sounds about right. Let's do it.
Cool. Max, real quick before we get out of here, I think everyone already knows, but just in case somebody's jumping on this podcast in this episode for the first time, if that's you, go back and listen to more of them. But go ahead and just let everyone know where they can follow you and give a quick plug to Hyrule Interviews.
Yeah. So, were you asking me to tell people where to find me?
Yes.
I guess it's for me too.
All of the above.
So I run HyruleInterviews.com, which is a database of quotes and interviews with every person who has ever worked on a Zelda game. That's the goal. I don't actually have the interview for everyone yet, but I've got several hundred interviews in the database and several hundred quotes, and I keep adding more over time. And a lot of this historical information that I share in the podcast comes from just reading all this stuff and remembering a lot of it. So you can find us on Twitter or at HyruleInterviews.com.
Excellent. Definitely go give that a look. It adds some great context. It's a great source of research, and there's a lot of interesting nuggets to be gleaned there. And of course, it's ever expanding. So definitely follow Max on Twitter for as long as Twitter continues existing, I guess.
Elon, thank you so much.
Man, it's rough out there right now, y'all. But go give that a follow and just keep up with his ongoing efforts to catalog as many developer thoughts as he can dig up. All right. Well, I think that's going to do it for today. Let's go ahead and get out of here. If you enjoyed today's show and you would like a little extra Sacred Realms in your life, you can head over to patreon.com/Sacred Realms Pod and become a patron. If you've got no rupees, it's not a problem. 5-star Apple Podcast reviews are a great free way to support us. More reviews means that more people see our show. That makes us very happy Hylians. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Sacred Realms Pod for updates on the podcast and for behind the scenes action. Sacred Realms will be back next Wednesday with a bonus episode rounding out season 6, talking about our final thoughts on the 8-bit era of Zelda games. Of course, we always love for you to play along with us and to share your thoughts on our social channels. Both The Legend of Zelda and The Adventure of Link can be played in a variety of places. They can be played on the Nintendo NES, the Nintendo NES Mini. They can be played in a variety of eShops. They can be played on the Nintendo Switch online service, which is the version that Matt and I were playing. Real quick note as well, like we've been mentioning, next game we're playing is going to be the Wind Waker. If you want to go ahead and start playing that game in advance of our new season, that can be played, unfortunately, in only 2 sort of 3 places. It can be played on the GameCube. It can be played on the Nintendo Wii U in its HD remaster version. Or, of course, if you have access to emulation software, you can run it on your Steam Deck or wherever, which actually a lot of people, I gather, are doing. Unfortunately, it's not out on the Switch, and so we're mentioning it here because we realize that some of y'all who want to play along with us may need a little extra runway to secure a way in which to play it, and we wish you the best of luck in that endeavor. It's rough out there for people who want to play a few of these Zelda games. This is the first one that we're not going to be able to play on a handheld system, like in bed.
Yeah, we're going to have to do some actual TV time. So, I'm going to have to prep my girlfriend for, hey, next time you're over, I might be playing Wind Waker on the TV, so you can't just watch Netflix while I play Zelda. Sorry.
That's okay. It's going to be a great
It'll
time.
be a thing, and I'm very excited for it, because I've been looking forward to playing this game. It's kind of well known at this point that I have not actually ever played the Wind Waker all the way through. I'm very much looking forward to my first experience with this game.
Going to be a great time. We'll get into that in the next few weeks. But in the meantime, may your hearts be full. May your arrows never miss. We'll catch y'all next week. Sacred Realms is an independent podcast production, which is produced, edited, and mixed by me, Lyndon Willoughby. Our music comes from Zelda and Chill by Mikkel and is graciously provided to us by Mikkel and Game Chops Records. Zelda and Chill is available to stream on Spotify or to purchase directly from GameChops.com. Finally, our thanks go to Nintendo for creating such exceptional and innovative experiences.